Welcome you back to the Patrick Netherton Show right here on 1130 The Tiger. He's Rogers. I'm Patrick. Hope everyone is doing well. We're pleased to welcome in from The Athletic, one of the best college football writers there is. She is Nicole Auerbach, who is, had herself a busy last couple of weeks here. Nicole, first of all, we haven't talked in a little while. How are you? How's everything?
I am hanging in there. It has been a busier June than usual, and honestly, it's going to stay busy here for a little bit with NIL and Supreme Court case. So, just trying to get a little rest when I can.
Yeah, well, normally, it's May, June is normally the time to take off, right? You go and you take your vacation and do all that, but college football has sort of reached NFL levels of 24/7, 365, it seems like. There's no time off.
Yep, we are definitely there. And again, like a lot of this stuff, playoff expansion and NIL, it's going to be like an ongoing thing, but this really is a unique summer in terms of like a lot of stuff is happening for the first time right now. Yeah,
speaking of the college football playoff expansion, completely blindsided. Now, you had a report on this back in January where it felt like maybe there was going to be some different things that perhaps we were going to be surprised by. Were you at all surprised that they just shot right past 6, 8, 10 and went all the way to 12?
Yeah, I am. I think, for a few years now, there had been an assumption that, 8 would be that next step. But the more time you spend with the 12 model and you think about it and you think about all the different compromises that had to take place to get to that point, it makes sense that you skip past it. But yeah, I mean, for a long time, people had just been operating under this assumption that there would be 8 at some point. So it's definitely a little jarring to think about blowing past that.
And the amount of secrecy involved. Ross Dellinger had a really good report from SI. You obviously and your compatriots at The Athletic have done a lot of great reporting on it. But the idea that this sort of working group that they put together was able to keep this a secret for the better part of a year and a half to 2 years, that to me might be the most shocking part of all of this.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely been open conversation, publicly about, just the frustrations with the way that things were, with the size, with the four, some of the unintended side effects, the way that, it kind of sucked oxygen out of the room. We were only ever seeing the same few teams. So all of that had been, it had become an open conversation. But I think, the breadth of the, and just kind of the depth of what they were looking at, how many models, that was new to a lot of people because I think they did want to get really far down the line before any of that started to leak. We know how hung up everyone was about the concept of a playoff for so long during the BCS era. So I think they wanted to have a lot of this buttoned up before anything really started to get out publicly.
Did anything other than 12, did anything really catch you off guard when it came to the final announcement? Obviously, they still have to put it in front of the full group, and they have to go through all of that. It's not a done deal yet, but it feels like it's going to be something reasonably close to what they put out. Did any of it catch you off guard?
No, again, except just that we went past 8.
Yeah.
Because I just think that was what I think so many people had operated under the assumption, that when it expanded, whenever that was, that it would be 8. And I think that was the only element that was overall surprising, because I do think since really December 2018, I reported then that people were getting frustrated and they wanted to look at this thing to expand it before the end of the contract in 2025, 2026. And now we know that they did form that working group a month later. So it's been something that has been bothering people for some time now. And 12 certainly addresses the access, the engagement issues throughout the regular season. But, now looking back and seeing, okay, well, I liked 8. I liked the way that 8 works. But understanding that the SEC wanted more at large spots, now you see how you get to 12. And again, the more time I spend with the model, the more I like it. But I was, a proponent of 8, and I would have been fine with a pit stop at 8 before we eventually went bigger than that.
Yeah, and the thing that, there's a lot of the playoff purists out there that say, oh, this is going to water down the regular season. And my contention's always been it may water down the beginning of the regular season because an early loss may not kill you. but it's going to make so many more games down the stretch actually mean something. And that's exciting because, Nicole, quite frankly, we've had so many weeks at the end of years past that just there's like one game that means something and the rest of the games are just throwaways. I'm excited about more games actually meaning something down the stretch.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't necessarily think that the early season stuff is that bad either, because we have seen, certain teams have been able to endure an early loss and it doesn't really write them off, right? But it's not consistent across the board. So if Alabama loses, we're like, all right, well, they're not totally done. Yet we act that way about the Pac-12. So I don't know if that part is going to be as different as people think, but I do think the idea of, conference races mattering as you get through November, pay attention to the Pac-12 championship, things that people just kind of are disengaged with, that stuff is going to be the biggest difference, because that stuff matters now. There will be bids at stake. It's going to matter relative to other conferences and things like that. But I think, this idea of at-large spots and the criteria and evaluating all of that, but also having it so that if there is a Coastal and a Cincinnati in different conferences, that they both do get a fair shake and they both could make it in the same year. I think that sort of thing is going to be really nice. And I think we're going to be talking about so many more teams. We're going to be so much more engaged in conference races through November that, that's going to be fine. Even if we watch Oklahoma play Ohio State in September and the loser, we don't have to say that they're eliminated. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Only negative that I see, and again, this plan isn't in stone yet, but the plan seems to be right now home sites for the first games while the top four get buys, and then you start bringing the bowls in from there. Only negative I see is while the top four get buys, they don't get a home game in that system. I would love to see maybe 2 weeks of home games and then for the Final Four use the bowls kind of like you do now. Do you see any negatives? I mean, I know that they talk about unintended consequences that they can't foresee that'll happen, but what do you see that maybe is on the negative side?
Well, I think, a lot of fans have had the same issue that you did, but I think you got to look at this from the perspective of, the bowl system has been part of, all these iterations. It's been part of the 14 playoffs. It would be a drastic. It would, they absolutely could cut the bowl system out or cut them to the very end. But they have been partners for a long time. I think there's still something to this idea of going somewhere at the end of the season and finishing at a neutral site that was attractive enough to the people who are putting together this proposal. So any of these aspects could be revisited when the rest of the commissioners get involved. But I think that one might be more of a fan reaction than the people involved in the decision-making about the on-campus game. And also athletic directors would obviously love to have more home games as well. The only other thing I think of here is that if you have games essentially, spots essentially locked up, if you're Clemson, you've basically locked up, a spot in the ACC championship game with a few games to go, do you rest players because you're adding games? Do we start dealing with an era of load management in college football? I think it's possible. But again, I don't know if that's an unintended side effect if we know that is something that could happen. And technically probably could have happened already, especially, with some of these lopsided conferences where you do have people who lock up spots early. So that would be one, just as you're adding games. And it'd be hard to fault the players for doing that because they are being asked to play in more games if they make it all the way through.
Talking to Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic, a little college football for you. Let's switch from the playoffs to names, image, and likeness because that is back in the forefront. We've got another Senate hearing happening here shortly. More former athletes and current athletes are being called to testify, to talk to the senators. You've got states that are passing laws left and right. Texas, our neighbor here, Texas already said ours is starting in July the 1st. Louisiana's rushing to get theirs through. It's on the desk of the governor. The NCAA says we can't do anything, that the federal government has to do something. The federal government saying the NCAA needs to do something. Where are we at and where are we headed with this, Nicole?
Well, I think we're still ultimately going to end up in the place of having a federal law. The question has been for a couple weeks now, whether or not that would be something that was really narrow, that people, i.e. the Republican side, we're going to try to push through and pass now. And then you have Democratic senators like Cory Booker who really want to incorporate more about health care after people's playing days into that bill. So the question of whether or not it's just going to be NIL or something broader is a sticking point. And it's part of the reason that it's slow. I think there's still overall an expectation that the NCAA will change its rules. So even if you have, let's say, 10 states that have NIL set to take effect July 1, you would have some sort of allowance for everyone else and all the other states to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. Even if the rules are a little different, even if it's just, an NCAA rule versus like state law. But eventually there's going to have to be a federal law that oversees all of this and supersedes the state law.
I think people get the impression, Nicole, and I'd like you to either agree or disagree with that. I think people get the impression that once name, image, and likeness happens, Phil Knight comes out and buys all the best players that he can. Now, granted, they're not supposed to be able to do this in recruiting, but maybe the transfer portal, right? He says, hey, come to Oregon. Nike's going to put you on a name, image, and likeness contract. We're going to pay you a bunch of money, more than anybody else is willing to pay you, and we're going to just field a super team of guys that we're buying. Agree or disagree that is something that could actually happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, that's a lot of money to spend on stuff that you're not necessarily sure is going to, kind of come back to you. But the deal here is, like, these are going to be third parties. Some people are going to make some money. There's going to be some stuff where people maybe, it's not necessarily the market value. Maybe someone's overpaying and then they correct it. They're not going to pay tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year on every single class to tell people they're going to get, a billboard or an Instagram post or something like that. I think that's just kind of some fear mongering. There's going to be people who are absolutely going to profit. It's going to take some work for a lot of other people. I mean, there's people who really devote time and energy to YouTube channels and are very entrepreneurial, and they'll be able to do that type of thing and cash in. But I think it's going to look different than what everyone is trying to claim. I mean, I think it's going to look like influencers do on Instagram and social media versus, all billboards and whatever. But we're going to see. And, even if Phil Knight decided he wanted to spend a lot of money every single year and entice athletes and do Nike deals with them, I don't really see what the problem is, because if someone's choosing how to spend their money, it's going to be very hard to do anything that would stop that.
Yeah, and
but
like
again,
you said,
it can't be through the school directly.
Yeah, and like you said, there's not a huge return on investment if you pay $100,000 to a running back to come to Oregon. All right, last thing before I let you go. We're seeing this a lot now. A lot of NFL players, especially Zach Wilson today, got asked about it. Christian McCaffrey got asked about it. Are you vaccinated? As a journalist, do you think that it is okay, and that is a question that needs to be asked of players, coaches, administrators, whatever, if they're vaccinated?
Well, I think we're seeing that it's impacting availability, player availability. It affects the team dynamic. If someone's not there, they get contact traced out. We saw the NFL put out their policies. It's very, very different for vaccinated players than unvaccinated players. So it ends up affecting, the games and the competitions and availability. So I think it's newsworthy for sure. And I think that, especially when you have these leagues making policies that are very different, it's absolutely within bounds to ask people if they are, because it's going to be the way that they get handled throughout the season. If they're going to be expected, to be available all the time, unless they, are injured or something, versus, something that, contact tracing or something that would have been avoidable. If they had done this, they would have been available all season. So I think, yes, absolutely. I think we've seen it in a number of pro sports as they've gotten underway. College sports, I think, will be a little different. I think you're going to have a fair amount of these colleges mandating vaccination for all students. So, there will be football programs that will be fully vaccinated and, probably won't have nearly the types of disruptions that we had last year, where you could have an entire, position group get contact traced out. I think it's within bounds. I think it's important because it's about player availability, and these leagues are trying to incentivize players to get vaccinated. And you're seeing how differently they're going to get treated and how much easier it is on a daily basis to know that you'd be available to practice, know that you'd be available to play, and not sit in a hotel room. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely within bounds.
Nicole, you're the best. Give Red a treat for me. Make sure you give him some pats and scratches for us. You're the best. Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
Nicole Auerbach, college football writer for The Athletic.